Good evening, everyone. My name is Arnie Eisen, Chancellor of JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this evening. For those of you who are at JTS for the first time, please feel welcome and don't make it your last. And let me begin by reminding first-time visitors and long-time visitors that it's now time to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Tonight's program is JTS's Jack and Louis Rudin Lecture. The Rudin Lecture series at JTS provides the opportunity for eminent academics, religious leaders, intellectuals, and public figures to discuss topics of interest with the JTS community and the public at large. Although Jack and Susan Rudin unfortunately could not be with us this evening, and the representative of the Rudin Foundation, our good friend Dr. Mark Bodden, also had to cancel at the last minute because of scheduling conflicts, we'd like to thank them all for sponsoring yet another fine Rudin Lecture in our series, which is named for Mr. Rudin and his late brother, Louis. Of course, it's also a great pleasure to extend our welcome to tonight's speaker, General Norton Schwartz, and tonight's moderator, Chaplain Captain Stephen Ream. General Schwartz's topic, as you know, is Shalom, Shalom, yet there is no peace, waging peace and making war. This program is co-sponsored by JTS's Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies and co-hosted by the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University. We want to thank them for their involvement, and we particularly would like to welcome the Saltzman Institute's faculty and students who are joining us. I have a few other thanks which I'm happy to extend. First, to the leadership led by Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove and the members of Park Avenue Synagogue, where our moderator, Rabbi Reen, serves as assistant rabbi. To the members and officers of the New York area ROTC and their commandant, and the group of Jewish military chaplains who are attending tonight's program. On a program note, we encourage you to pose a question to General Schwartz, and this will be handled by moderator Rabbi Ream. So you should have index cards given to you upon entry. Please jot your question down on the index card, and at a certain point, we'll collect the questions, and our moderator will handle them and pose them to General Schwartz. I'm now pleased to call upon Judy Greenberg, soon to be Rabbi Judy Greenberg, a senior in our rabbinical school, who will be ordained this coming May, to lead us in the lighting of the Hanukkah candles and the singing of Ma'oz Tzor.
Everyone has a sheet in front of them or the words in your mind, and please join with me. Please rise. Thank you. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Chanukah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'asa nisim lavoteinu bayamim hahem b'azman hazeh. Ma'osor Yeshuati L'chana Elishabeach Tikon Betefilati V'sham Toda Nizabeach Le'tachid Matbeach Mitzoram Nabeach Azegmor B'shir Mizmor Chanukah sheltering tower. Furious they assailed us, but thine arm availed us, and your word broke their sword when our own strength failed us, and thy word broke their sword when our own strength failed us. Chag Urim Sameach, happy Hanukkah. You may be seated. Let's begin.
Thank you, Judy. So that awful, arresting rhyme in the song we just sang, where word is made to rhyme with sword, because they both have the W-O-R-D, and the claim that the word is going to defeat the sword, perhaps is an entry point into the discussion we're going to have tonight. Before I introduce Rabbi Reen to introduce General Schwartz, perhaps I could sharpen the point by saying that in our home, when we light candles, as in many of yours, we probably would have gone on to sing Mi Yimalel Gvurot Yisrael, followed by the English translation, which, as we'll see in a moment, is not really a translation, but quite a dramatic change in the original. So sometime in the 1930s, in a Jewish Zionist youth movement, a poet took Psalm 106, which talked about retelling the glories of the Lord, and asks us to speak about Gvurot, not of God, but of Yisrael. Otan miyimna, who can count the glories of Israel, of the Jewish people? He made a point of saying that Maccabee with Moshiach Ufodeh, taking two words that are ascribed to God's redemptive power in the book of Exodus, and saying that not God will do these, but the Maccabee will be Moshiach Ufodeh, and making the point that in Yameinu, in our day perhaps, as opposed to those ancient days, Kol Am Yisrael Yitached, Hitpa'el tent, will unite itself, will arise, Yakum, Veyigael, will redeem itself. And of course, the English translation, which happened in America in the 1940s, for reasons that we don't know, but we can guess at, took the more rabbinic point of view and asks us to retell the things that befell us in every age, a hero or sage. A hero or sage comes to our aid. Here we have it. Is this the conflict between the spirit of peace and the spirit of war in Judaism? Is this the biblical versus the rabbinic? Is it two themes in Jewish tradition which we know clash every Hanukkah, because at Hanukkah we generally celebrate God's saving power through the instrument of those Maccabees? Whatever we do, we are paying homage to the set of dilemmas in Jewish history and in general history that we're going to explore this evening with the help of General Schwartz. To enter us into this illuminating discussion, it's my pleasure to call on Rabbi Chaplain Stephen Ream, who is a reserve chaplain in the U.S. Air Force. Rabbi Ream has served at several bases around the country, is now the chaplain at Langley Air Force Base in Langley, Virginia, and I'm proud to say that Rabbi Captain Ream received his rabbinic ordination and an MA in Talmud and Rabbinics from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2009. Rabbi Ream.
I must say I'm having a bit of a Joseph moment, who had dreams of stars, although I think it was more than 4 stars that he dreamed of. For members, and specifically Jewish members of the U.S. Armed Forces, and for all Jews in America, Hanukkah represents a great tension. This December dilemma, not the one you're used to hearing about between Hanukkah and Christmas, will play out before your very eyes this evening. Our speaker, General Norton Schwartz, was the senior military leader of the United States Air Force, whose mission is to fly, fight, and win in air, space, and cyberspace. Yet we are gathered here on the 6th night of Hanukkah, a holiday infused by the familiar words of Zechariah, not by might and not by power, but rather by my Spirit. Like the Maccabees of old and the Maccabees of today, we are caught by the tension between the reality of war and our desire to pursue peace. Perhaps the solution, both in those days and now, is not found in having to choose between might and spirit, but rather in embracing both values. Embedded in Hanukkah is the message that necessary as war may be, equally important is how military victory is won. In his reflections on the effects of war, the 18th century military theorist Karl von Clausewitz explained that the physical forces and the moral forces are completely fused. They're not to be decomposed like a metal alloy by a chemical process. In other words, when it comes to war, victory must mean moral success, together with physical triumph. It is with this understanding that I reread Zechariah's words, not by might nor by power alone, but with my Spirit. Indeed, be it the Continental Army in 1776, the IDF in 1967, or the battles of our own day, without ethical leadership and a moral compass guiding our efforts, no true victory can be achieved. This evening, we will hear from such an ethical leader, a leader who has dedicated his life to serving as a light unto our nation, ensuring that the light of this country not only remains lit, but will continue to burn more brightly into the future. As a graduate of this institution, a chaplain in the United States Air Force, and a congregational rabbi in New York, I am both honored and humbled to introduce General Norton Schwartz. General Schwartz grew up in Toms River, New Jersey, the son of Simon Schwartz, a former United Synagogue president. He was a chapter president in USY. He attended the United States Air Force Academy, graduating in 1973. General Schwartz retired from the U.S. Air Force on October 1st of this year. He served more than 39 years on active duty in Europe, Asia, and the United States. He served as a commander 7 times, including 2 4-star assignments as commander, U.S. Transportation Command, and Chief of Staff, U.S. Air Force. In the former role, he was responsible for transportation for the Department of Defense by air, land, and sea. In the latter, he was responsible for 680,000 military and civilian Air Force personnel and a budget of over $100 billion. He is thrilled to return to JTS to describe his memorable journey of service and to offer insights of interest to this unique audience and the larger American Jewish community. General Schwartz.
Stephen, thanks so very much. It's a special privilege, ladies and gentlemen, to join with the leadership and guests of this exceptional and preeminent institution of Jewish higher education. And your goal of integrating academic scholarship with the teaching of pathways for strengthening Jewish traditions and Jewish communities is a decades-old mission, as you all know. So thank you for the honor of inviting Susie and me here this evening. When I chose my career path so many years ago now, I would never imagine that I would have had the opportunity to come back here as an adult after visiting on numerous occasions in my youth. I had many rich memories. You see, my father, in addition to his office supply business, was active in the Jewish community in Toms River in New Jersey for many years and served, as you heard, as the president of the United Synagogue way back then. He would come to New York to do business, and on occasion, I would tag along. And after he completed his work, we would grab a bite. Sometimes it was a very big bite at what I recall was the Society Deli, or visit Barney's, or on a very special day, go up to the ballpark to see a game. I'll be a bit ambiguous about which team earned his and my allegiance, for fear of not offending anybody in the audience tonight. But I can tell you that it wasn't Yankee Stadium. But we are here, and here we are, ladies and gentlemen, over 40 years later. And Susie and I are truly thrilled to be your guest. Tonight, I'd like to offer you a window. It's a window into a world that many only read about. The world of the U.S. Armed Forces is well chronicled, but the world of being what fundamentally was the chief operating officer of your United States Air Force is not so often captured in the media or in books written about our military. So tonight, if you would, allow me to share with you an abbreviated history of Jewish leaders in the U.S. Armed Forces, my own experience in the leadership sandbox, make a few observations on Middle East political theater, and offer for you, for your consideration, a specific call to action. And of course, answer your questions and those of Rabbi Reen. But before I begin, I thought we might try a little bit of audience participation this evening. And may I ask at this time, if you're able, may I ask all the veterans in the audience tonight to please stand up. I'm curious if the two of you would mind stay standing, please. May I ask you both to share with the audience, what does it mean to you to be a veteran? Because America is so very proud of you. Please, sir, if you would. Well said, sir. Sir.
My brother Leonard, who died a few months ago, was a World War II veteran. My brother Edward is a veteran of the Korean conflict, and I served in the Vietnam theater. And we have no more brothers, so I would hope there'll be no more wars.
Thanks to all of you, and certainly to these two, for your service and your willingness to call attention, no doubt unwarranted, to yourselves. Now may I ask those in the audience who have a son or daughter, or a grandson or granddaughter, who is a veteran or is currently serving on active duty in the armed forces, to please stand up as well. Thank you, sir. I know it's not an easy decision to be supportive of a child who aspires to take advantage of a military career. But in my experience, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. Armed Forces is one of the finest classrooms for teaching and preparing young people to be successful in life. Thank you for indulging in this little bit of this exercise in forensics. My purpose was not to make anyone uncomfortable, but to suggest that while members of the American Jewish community serve in many noteworthy professions, from the law to medicine to science and beyond, my observation is that somewhat fewer choose to pursue a career in the armed forces of the United States. And if you agree that our experiment here tonight suggests that Jewish youth tend to pursue professions other than the military, I would hope to provoke some thinking on why that seems to be the case. In short, ladies and gentlemen, am I an anomaly? In short, should military service be more highly valued within the Jewish American culture? The reality is that Jewish men and women have served with distinction in the U.S. Armed Forces long before my tenure. For example, Admirals Uriah Levy and Hyman Rickover of the Navy, Medal of Honor recipient Sergeant John Levitow of my Air Force. But our history of distinguished service is much more extensive than those notable individuals. One such example is Frederick Mayer, a Jewish German emigre to Brooklyn, here in the city, in the 1930s. Frederick Mayer was a renowned member of the Office of Strategic Services, or OSS. Mayer joined the Army Infantry after immigrating to the United States, but was recruited into the OSS because of his street sense, his survival instincts, and his language skills. He was a good soldier, but he was an even better agent. Frederick Mayer led a team of agents parachuting from a B-24 into German-occupied Austria on a dark night in early 1945. The operation was known as Greenup. His team collected vital intelligence that was important to the coming invasion of Europe, and even determined, among other things, specifically where Hitler resided in Berlin. As Germans were preparing to reinforce Italy, Mayer reported the pending movement of 26 40-car train loads of supplies that were subsequently targeted and destroyed by the Allied air forces. He also learned that the German factory for manufacturing the new and the quite extraordinary Me-262 jet fighter aircraft was essentially idle due to the absence of spare parts. He learned this, quite amazingly, by becoming an employee on the production line. Mayer was ultimately apprehended by the German authorities during the Greenup mission and was jailed. Despite torture, he did not submit. Later, after a clever escape, and almost unbelievably, Mayer was instrumental in securing the surrender of German forces in and around Innsbruck, all without a shot, as the war came to a close. I relate this story of extraordinary courage by a German refugee who Susie and I had the opportunity to meet. Simply, and he's still alive, simply to make the point that Frederick Mayer is representative, not atypical, of the military service of Jewish veterans. Benjamin Kaufman earned the Medal of Honor for his service at Argonne in 1918 and later served as the national commander of the Jewish war veterans in the 1940s. Major General Milton Foreman earned the Distinguished Service Cross in France while serving as a colonel in World War II. Listen to this. Tibor Rubin, a Hungarian Holocaust survivor who lost both parents in the same Nazi concentration camp in which he survived, later became a prisoner of war in Korea for 2.5 more years. Think of that. He earned a Distinguished Service Cross as well. And of course, Colonel Jack Jacobs, many of you know him, of the Army earned the Medal of Honor for his service in Vietnam, as did his enlisted Air Force counterpart I mentioned earlier, Sergeant John Levitow. And more recently, Lieutenant Liz Schulte, an Air Force Academy graduate of the class of 2006, made the ultimate sacrifice on our behalf in Afghanistan. So, ladies and gentlemen, should you care, should you have an interest in who from the Jewish community serves in as noble and selfless a profession as I know of, I would suggest, humbly, you should and you must. Susie and I spent 39 years in the Air Force. I had the opportunity to attend the Air Force Academy. I served in command positions all over the world, watched and participated in our national security policy making process up close and personal for a number of years, and ultimately completed the tour of 4 years as the Chief of Staff of our United States Air Force. What did I learn? Ladies and gentlemen, senior positions in government service are as difficult as the most difficult jobs in the public sector, with a multitude of competing pressures: professional, personal, financial, and yes, political. But in the end, not unlike the private sector, it is clear thinking and value-based decision-making and can-do, lead-from-the-front attitude that succeeds. Self-promotion and selfishness are immediately and on occasion totally discredited. Our military leadership makes mistakes, to be sure. But with a few notable exceptions, those mistakes are the result of a test of will between combatants in battle, in which not all outcomes are easily predicted or assured. But mistakes of character and integrity, they are unforgivable because they undermine the bonds of trust amongst those who go to fight, as well as the vital respect that the American people have for their armed forces. I found military service so rewarding, in part because the Jewish values of hard work, the importance of education, the commitment to public service, and a true sense of community prevail in that culture, even with the highly visible deviations from the norm that occur from time to time. I found military service challenging because you can, in fact, fool some fans, but you can't fool the players in our business. Our non-commissioned officers in particular can smell a fake a mile away. Only consistency and standards earn and keep their respect. Only trust will compel a soldier or sailor or airman or Marine or Coast Guardsman to make the ultimate sacrifice. No amount of authority can produce the motivation for victory that is required when lives hang in the balance. Let me shift now, briefly, to an issue of mutual interest. What I have observed during my interaction with counterparts in the Middle East, and my sense of our nation's strategic priorities there. Clearly, our approach has been to avoid bloodshed and conflict, toward the larger purpose of securing and enduring peace. There are absolutists on both sides of the Arab-Israeli divide, although very few of them, in my experience, serve in uniform. Survival is a powerful instinct, and it is present in both the Israeli population and the Palestinian entities. While some emphasize survival above all other considerations, and it is a profound consideration indeed, prudent risk-taking is also a virtue of culture and leadership. I have found a number of military counterparts in the region who may be more disposed toward such calibrated risk-taking than are their political masters. I remember a quote my father taught me long ago. He said that neither an individual nor a nation has to be cruel to be tough. I leave it to you to judge the merits of this survival versus risk-taking orientation, and which approach or a thoughtful combination of the two can best achieve long-term peace. It's pretty clear to me, however, that absolutism will not produce longer-term stability or a lasting reduction in simmering hostilities. It hasn't in our own negotiations over the fiscal cliff, and it's unlikely to lead to positive outcomes elsewhere. Finally, let me go back to where we began. There is one, I think, Reserve Officer Training Corps cadet here in the audience tonight. If I may I ask that young person, that young officer, who will serve as an officer in our armed forces, to please stand. Is she here? Thank you. Thank you for what you are endeavoring to do. We need you. For those of you with college-age youngsters, would you entertain your son or your daughter joining this young officer aspirant who has chosen to serve? Would you encourage your son or daughter to consider such service? While I am certainly a champion for military service, as that has been a very rewarding career path for Susie and me, I don't make a distinction between uniformed and other public service. But for influencers here in this grand hall tonight, I appeal to you to follow the lead of this wonderful ROTC volunteer by encouraging those over whom you exercise some influence to consider the pathway of public service through the gateway of the United States Armed Forces. For those who will serve, the experience and the opportunities are precious and so very much needed. In short, ladies and gentlemen, the country needs good people and leaders in the defense sector. And I found that good people frequently become great leaders. Certainly, the reputation and stature of the Jewish community would benefit from such notable public service as well. Thank you for the opportunity to address each of you this evening. Susie and I shared a unique American journey guided quietly by our upbringing and the associated value system. As I commented many times to Air Force audiences, however, while I served as Chief of Staff, I said that the only faith that we in the Air Force promote is public service. I hope I have succeeded in doing that tonight. It's now time for Rabbi Reams and your questions. Thank you so much for your memorable hospitality. And your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, General Schwartz. I would now like to ask those who would like to pose a question to General Schwartz to pass their question cards to the center aisles where ushers will collect them.
And I did attempt earlier to ask the professors from Columbia to be nice to me tonight.
Okay. General, you spoke a little bit about the conflict in the Middle East. I would like to ask if you can comment on the challenges faced by your Israeli counterpart, General Amir Eshel, the commander of the Israeli Air Force, as he balances international public opinion and the need to defend his country against potential threats.
Yeah, in the end, and this is certainly true in both of our countries, we respond to political leadership. But I do think that Ido Nehushtan, my counterpart for our tenure, who's now retired Israeli Air Force, and the Israeli uniformed leadership deserves great credit for Iron Dome. This was a high-risk effort, engineering development effort. And they pursued this despite skepticism because they believed that defending populated areas would increase decision space for the political leadership. In fact, it has done that. And so there is a lesson in that for us, that most of us believe, if I can use the vernacular, that kicking ass is what we do. And the better you do it, and the quicker, it's probably the right formula. However, what has happened is that the Israelis have demonstrated how defense can serve profound interests as well to avoid escalation. This is a very powerful development, and one that I think Nehushtan and others certainly deserve credit for.
Thank you. Ever since I was commissioned in 2005, I've been asked numerous times about the religious climate of the Air Force. In 2005 and 2006, your predecessor, General Mosley, disseminated guidelines for the free exercise of religion. Last September, all airmen, including myself, received an email from you with an attached memorandum about maintaining government neutrality regarding religion. Mm-hmm. Finally, just before you retired, you certified a publication with mandatory compliance outlining, among many cultural issues, this subject of government neutrality, the free exercise of religion, and religious accommodation. What precipitated you to pen this document, and how would you describe the current religious climate in the Air Force?
I think it's healthy, and a diverse climate, whether it be in faith areas or other areas, is important for us as an institution. But I think the key point is that the Armed Forces is different than most other institutions. Because, Stephen, I think you would agree, if I tell you to jump, well, in the past, command is a very special thing. And it is vitally important that commanders exercise discretion and care when suggesting to others what are the values and standards that they believe are essential for future success. It was important that our leaders understand that they had an obligation to allow free exercise, but not to champion any particular faith or belief system, because subordinates read that in a way that is unique to the military culture and not healthy, in my view, for our Air Force. And so we wanted to make something that in years gone by was understood more explicit, because it needed to be. And I would only mention one other aspect, and that's something you truly understand, that the chaplaincy in the Armed Forces is also unique. Because Rabbi Ream does not just minister to Jewish members of the Air Force or the Armed Forces, but he must offer spiritual assistance and guidance to all members of the Armed Forces, and certainly our Air Force. This is the motivation for ensuring that people may believe and may practice as they wish, but if they are a commander, they have to use care and not imposing their own personal beliefs on others.
A few years ago, Colonel David Graham, Executive Director of the U.S. Army's Judge Advocate General's Legal Center, wrote about an encounter he had with attorneys from Europe and Asia. These attorneys were criticizing our country's decisions in the global war on terrorism and some of the tactics that we had undertaken. They concluded their comments with the following, quote, "Your actions are all the more troubling in the sense that, in terms of the law of war, you were the gold standard. You were the ones we looked up to. We had placed you on a pedestal. General, in your estimation, is the armed forces of the United States meant to be on that pedestal, a light unto the nations, and do you feel that we have fallen from our pedestal?"
I certainly don't. And, you know, there is this sort of argument out there that somehow remotely piloted, or I would say remote sorts of combat, are somehow less worthy, less honorable, less ethical, less moral than combat up close and personal. If that were the case, ladies and gentlemen, we would still be using spears, but we're not. Technology has allowed us to increase the distance between combatants. Now, is that fair? If it means saving American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, I say it's very fair. Now, the reality is that none of this is really about what we do. Or I should say it's not really about how we do it, what platform we use, what vehicle, what weapon, and so on. What this is really about is the target legitimate? And there may be a fair discussion about that. But I can tell you from personal experience that one of the things that remotely piloted aircraft in particular have offered in the last 15 years is persistence on the battlefield. So you're watching a potential target 24 hours a day for days on end. And you can conclude with that sort of persistence, is this the right bad guy or not? The law of war requires two things: proportionality and discrimination. And I would argue that correctly engaging a target of one rather than many, if it's a legitimate target, complies with both mandates of the law of war.
Then I think the follow-up and challenge then is, in this age of asymmetric warfare, how do we make that distinction between civilians and combatants?
It's essential, and the way you do that, again, is by exercising care and using the technology at our disposal to differentiate between good guys and bad guys, or scenarios where it's unclear who is who. That's what leaders get paid for. And it's important for you to understand that people just don't do this on the fly. We have things called rules of engagement. And they are well thought out, and they are approved at the highest levels of government. And senior people as well as junior people have the obligation to comply with those rules of engagement.
What have been some of the greatest moral challenges of your military career?
Actually, you know, I don't think Susie and I have experienced a moral challenge in the warfighting kind of situation. You know what the toughest one is, frankly? It's speaking truth to power. It is telling my civilian secretary or the Secretary of Defense or the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or, on occasion, even the president, what I thought, in my best military judgment, he needed to know or hear. If we don't do that, if the leadership of the armed forces don't do that, we're political hacks. In fact, if we don't do that, you have the potential, ladies and gentlemen, for a development which I think is very worrisome, of having something called Republican generals and Democratic generals. And that is bad news for the Republic.
What moments or decisions are you most proud of during your military tenure?
Pinning an Air Force cross on a young man that was shot twice, continued to press until he was too weak to continue. Doing it on stage, it was just marvelous. It has been wonderful to see our babies grow up, right, Sue? These youngsters that we had either in our squadron or our wing or on staff along the way, and they grow up, and now you know it's time to move on when one of your babies pins on his 4-star. That happened just a few weeks ago. So, this is just like the seminary. Think about the folks here at the seminary, and they watch young rabbis or Jewish educators like yourself, others here, who move on and do good things. That's the privilege of doing what we do.
So I want to also touch on what you mentioned a few times on public service. Given the current defense budget, clearly not every American can serve in the military. So what alternative forms of public service would you recommend, and do you think this country could and or should have a mandatory period of civil service for all citizens?
Actually, I would favor that. I mean, not just in uniform. I mean, whatever form it would take, as I suggested earlier. I actually think that certain nations, including Israel, are sort of have a better formula than maybe we do in that respect. The truth of the matter is, and many here in the room know this, so you wouldn't be here tonight. We're fortunate as Americans. Think about this. Think about a young kid from a small town in South Jersey growing up to be the senior officer of our Air Force. What's the chances of that? It wouldn't happen in Europe. It wouldn't happen in the Asian militaries. This is uniquely American. And it requires all of our efforts, large and small, short or long, to sustain it. And public service is the way it gets done. So I don't, for a moment, think less of people that choose other paths. Not for a moment. But I won't hesitate to make the case that service in the government is as worthy as service on Wall Street or other significant professions like the law or medicine or the clergy. We need that too.
In your estimation as the now former Chief Operating Officer of the Air Force, given the proposed budget cuts that are trickling down, will we be able to defend ourselves in the ways that we have in the past?
Depending on how this is done, if it's done foolishly, we will do it badly. If the Department the Department of Defense has some discretion over where the budget cuts are applied, we can do it with a set of priorities that make sense. What will happen, in my view, is that the armed forces are going to get smaller. And if we do it right, we will maintain quality. And what that will mean for us, and let me take you back to March of 2011. Here's the scenario. There is an earthquake and tsunami in Japan, a major effort to assist our longtime partners and allies there. Devastating event. Oh, by the way, Libya kicks off, as you recall, and there was a bit of Air Force participation in that event. We're still operating in Iraq and Afghanistan at that time. We're backing out of Iraq and maintaining the surge in Afghanistan, and the President of the United States was traveling in South America at the time. And as some of you may know, when the President travels, it requires lots of aluminum in the air. That kind of surge effort, we probably in the future won't be able to do all 5 things at the same time. Maybe 3. So there'll be less capacity, but it'll be good. We think that's the right thing, the right path, the right formula. Trade capacity for quality. And there's a powerful reason for that, and the gentleman sitting up front here, I think, will reinforce this. Now, they'll tell me I'm full of it if they don't. But after 12 years of war, ladies and gentlemen, our youngsters understand the difference between being good and saying you're good. And we want to be the former and not the latter. Or they will walk, and their families will too.
Given we are operating more and more in a joint environment of all members of the armed forces sort of working together, what role does the Air Force, or really any service, have as being a unique and individual service as opposed to being one U.S. Armed Forces, U.S. Armed Force?
I think that there is a, look, in medicine, you wouldn't want an orthopedist to do heart surgery, right? You know, you wouldn't want a general practitioner to do brain surgery. In the law, you know, you wouldn't want a corporate sort of law person to save you at a murder trial in all likelihood. There, in all of the disciplines, there tends to be a bit of specialization. That's important in the armed forces as well. Doesn't mean we can't team. Doesn't mean that we can't get together and rock and roll when it's required. But it means that there is wisdom in allowing a bit of specialization, not necessarily overlap or excessive duplication, but specialization that makes sense. I would argue that the Air Force knows how to do air stuff better than others. That's as it should be. The Navy knows how to do maritime stuff. The Army knows how to take and secure land objectives. Together, we're pretty fair.
And over dinner, we were talking a little bit about what's necessary to bridge the military-civilian gap. And I know this is something that our current First Lady, Michelle Obama, has been trying to spearhead. What do you think is necessary to bridge that gap?
There are pluses and minuses about an all-volunteer force. An all-volunteer force is a professional force, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Some folks have suggested going back to the draft. That's nonsense. But there is a downside, and that is that we as a culture become too insular. Susie was mentioning at the table that, you know, in the Air Force, we became a separate service in 1947. We are now at the point where we have third and fourth generation youngsters serving. And it's a wonderful thing. So you've got grandfathers and fathers and sons and daughters, and in a few cases, grandsons and granddaughters serving now. Same family. Neat thing when you think that youngsters have experienced this lifestyle and decide to continue on themselves. They see the value, they see the rewards and such. But the downside is, again, that we become too insular, and that the broader American population, the other 99%, are not sufficiently vested in the security of the country. Enjoy the benefits, support those who do defend, but don't think seriously about encouraging their sons or daughters or grandsons and granddaughters to do likewise. Hopefully I've encouraged you, persuaded you to think about that a little bit tonight.
So I want to take some of the questions that were posed by members in attendance here this evening. And this is one question, actually, that I've thought about when asked if I would consider active duty as opposed to serving as a reservist, and that is the challenges to your family, spouse, children, careers of spouses, and stability of a child from moving from one place to another.
Okay, I'm going to break protocol here. This is something that is a passion for Susie. Do you want to address that question, my dear? Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see this one coming. I'm a brat, so I won't say how old I am, but anyway, for 50 plus years, I have been connected to the United States Air Force. I don't know any other life. But I will tell you that for the most part, it makes you stronger. I have moved, I don't even want to say how many times, 25, 30 times, I don't know. My last place we lived 4 years, that's the longest I've lived anywhere in my entire life. It was 4 years. The shortest was maybe 6 months. But it has been a wonderful experience. We now provide support like never before. That all volunteer brings with it a lot of support that happens for our families, for our spouses. If you've watched Mrs. Obama joining forces, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, I had direct access into the White House. I had direct access into the U.S. Chamber. I had direct access into a lot of organizations where I could pick up the phone, try to help spouses find a job or keep a job. We have access into education for our kids. Those two things are important. Spouse employment and education for kids. Those two things. They're always ranked number 1 and 2 across all the services. And that's where the focus has been for the last 10 years, and I think it will continue. And for the most part, our kids, we do not personally have kids, so I had several 100,000 Air Force kids as mine, but for the most part, they become the outgoing one. They're the ones that make the friends. They're the ones that join the team. They're the ones that are in charge of things. They don't have time. They don't have time to wait. So they charge into a school and make the best of it. And I think they come out stronger for the most part because of it. So does that answer the question?
Let me just say something of note for all of you is that you can tell that for Susie and me and our counterparts, you know, this is a team sport.
Another question here. What attracted you to service in the military in the first place? A nice young Jewish boy growing up in New Jersey, involved in USY, father, head of United Synagogue, arguably perhaps more difficult than Chief of Staff of the Air Force, I'm not sure. But what
I'm sure he would say yes, that's true.
so what was it that, what was the spark that attracted you to military service?
Actually, the original sort of motivation was interest in aviation. And so, you know, I remember riding my bicycle down to the Ocean County Airport and, you know, seeing the little light airplanes take off and land. And so that was the initial motivation. I think that I didn't quite know, but there was also a sense of purpose and a sense of order about, and this is the late 60s, so being in the service was not altogether popular then. But I had a sense that you know, number one, it was a scholarship, it was a free education as it turned out. I was going to get to fly. And by the time, you know, 4 years were done at the Air Force Academy, I kind of felt like this was pretty comfortable. You never know how it turns out because, as you all know, fortune plays a great role in how all of our lives progress and where we end up and what happens. And Susie and I certainly have had more than our share of good fortune. But one of the things that attracted me, I think, more than anything else, was a sense that the armed forces, although they were wounded then, were still a merit-based organization. That it didn't matter who you were, what color you were, you know, where you came from, whether your father was a typewriter salesman or a senator, you know, that there was an opportunity to have a rewarding career and be successful. And Lord knows it turned out that way, and we're grateful for that.
I'm often asked, mainly by fellow Jews, why I didn't choose to join the Israel Defense Force rather than the United States Air Force. Had you ever considered fighting for Israel?
I actually did. This was in high school. This was in, you know, right after 67, in fact. And the problem then, as it still is you lose your citizenship. And I think that's appropriate, by the way. And so it never really came to pass. But that sort of motivation was applied in a different area, and, you know, here we are today.
Can you comment a little bit on the relationship and the future of American and Israeli military cooperation?
Yeah. At the military-to-military level, believe me, the cooperation is enduring. No question about it. For example, Ido Nehushtan just tried to get a hold of us, you know, my counterpart in the Israeli Air Force, and just retired himself. So these relationships, you know, will certainly continue, and you know, the only difference between the Israeli Air Force and the U.S. Air Force is a matter of scale. They're good, we're good, but we're also bigger. So the bottom line is, at the military level, the respect and the relationship will certainly sustain itself as far as the eye can see. Politics is another matter, and, we'll see how that develops.
What do you think about the justification for preemptive warfare, and how or if is it different than the traditional defensive warfare?
Once again, if it is possible to know with a reasonable amount of certainty that attack planning is underway or a threat stream has developed to a point where it is a risk. Now look, you all had stuff happen here in the city. Would you rather have that thing, down by the theater district go off and then deal with it, or preempt it? I think it's foolishness to suppose that we should react to all possible threat streams. So I think that some of this is a law enforcement matter. Some is a matter for the armed forces, depending on the unique circumstances. But the bottom line is, I think that it was one thing when deterrence served a purpose against nation states with sort of a common method of dealing with one another. But non-state actors like Al-Qaeda and others, it is far more difficult to deter. And as a result, either you act or you will suffer, the pain. And I think for that reason, we have to be discriminating. We have to be certain to a reasonably high level, but we certainly don't have to accept the blow before we respond.
And finally, how would you suggest that current cadets, individuals who are aspiring or in basic training or otherwise, learn the moral judgment necessary to be a member of the U.S. Armed Forces?
I think it is, you don't sort of come to this all at once. The bottom line is that people need to start within their own bubble. So my bubble was a little bigger than yours. But within your bubble, you need to practice those values and such so that you make those moral judgments on those things that are within your purview. And you refine that judgment, and you watch others, and you get good advice from chaplains and others. And ultimately, if wonderful things happen, you end up being in a position where your moral judgment applies to lots of people. And that is a profound obligation. And the wonderful thing is that Susie and I got to realize that obligation. What's the chances of that? And now we'll continue to do good deeds, like this one tonight, I hope, and also ensure that the communities think in a more strategic context about the future of our country. That it's not city versus state. It's not party versus party. It's not candidate versus candidate. It's all of us. If Susie and I can continue to serve in a way that promotes that sort of approach, we will have lived a rich and rewarding life indeed. So, thank you very much, y'all.